Hi, I'm Matt Romoser, swine field specialist with the Iowa Pork Industry Center, and today I want to share a little information on gilt development, specifically around the environment we raise these gilts in. So we hear the phrase uttered a lot that we shouldn't raise our replacement gilts the same way we do as our market hogs. Oftentimes, space and stocking density is one of the key points that we're referring to when we talk about raising our gilts separate from how we would in pigs being sold for market. And space, unfortunately, can sometimes be difficult to accommodate for a multitude of reasons. When we think about if you're a farm that does internal multiplication, there's a chance you may have a surplus of gilts during certain times of the year. Possibly you're a farm that's undergoing a herd closure. So maybe in an effort to mitigate a disease or try to rid the herd of a disease, you may bring in a large group of gilts all at once, which can potentially constrain you from a square footage standpoint. Could also be looking at maybe doing a sow housing remodel. When we think about Prop 12 farms and trying to increase the amount of square footage they're providing for each sow, oftentimes the discussion comes to, do we need to use up some of the space within our GDU to be able to make more space for the sows? And I think that's a complex decision to be made, as the gilt development unit really needs to be operated to help benefit the farm, not just viewed as additional spaces within the farm itself. So we think about space, and oftentimes we think about space just within the GDU, but really a lot of that development and space allotment can benefit the gilt starting well before they arrive at the GDU. When we think about the environmental factors that impact future replacement gilts, can happen well before selection, and a lot of work that's been done in North Carolina State, specifically looking at that pre-weaning environment and how that can impact a gilt's future success. So some of the work that's been done looking at pre-weaning growth rate and weaning weight has shown positive relationship to parity 2 and then total productivity to parity 4, as well as some interesting cross-fostering work that's been done with pigs that were all born of similar litter sizes and then cross-fostered to either a large or a small litter. And those ones that essentially had less competition during that pre-weaning period ultimately had a higher retention rate, farrowing rate, and more born alive through parity 6. We then look at the GDU and we think about how can that space impact, or how much space does a gilt need to really optimize her success and retention in the herd. In general, we think that the more space that a gilt has, the more beneficial it is for development. Obviously, that all comes at a cost, and we need to be able to find that optimal space that not only sets that gilt up for success, but it's also suitable and feasible from a cost structure standpoint when we talk about building facilities. Certainly, there's some older data that shows positive association with space and stocking density. We look at some data done there in the mid-'80s, and we're looking at gilts. Obviously, are dramatically different from a genetic standpoint. The production systems and facilities were very different then. But even then, additional space showed positive relationship with ovulation rate by 100 kilograms, heavier pituitary and endocrine systems, and then also heavier reproductive tract as well. So we see some general benefit that we think could potentially lead to a more productive female in a herd. More recently, there's been some data that was done looking at increased space, more of a modern comparison of what you might see in 12 square feet versus 8 square feet. And in that particular study, it resulted in a younger age of puberty and increased number of gilts reaching puberty by 200 days old for those gilts that were provided 12 square feet during development versus 8 square feet. Other research, or more recent research, has also demonstrated that some of these similar findings, where we looked at increased square footage and how it positively impacts gilts. Specifically, some work that's been done found that increasing square footage resulted in increased body weight at breeding, an increased percentage of gilts that were pubertal by 28 weeks of age, and then also helped benefit the accuracy of the farm workers in their ability to actually detect heat in gilts on those farms. So in general, a lot of the data would suggest that providing those gilts with additional square footage is beneficial, albeit not always the easiest thing to do, as we've already discussed. But as far as operating that GDU, it's beneficial and it can help you operate at a higher square footage when you're operating it from an all-in, all-out pig flow, as well as maybe looking at it from a herdsmanship standpoint, culling some of those gilts that you're pretty sure are going to be non-selects earlier and removing them from the herd that way to increase the space allotment and reduce the stocking density for the gilts you think are likely to be kept for replacements in the herd there. Independent of them from square footage, we also need to think about other parts of the environment. When we think about air quality and ventilation, again, some data that's a little bit dated from a production system standpoint, but certainly still one that could be applicable in the sense of the ammonia levels we may encounter in GDUs or in farms today, where elevated ammonia levels greater than 21 parts per million were found to potentially impact purity attainment in gilts. And then also it's very important to be able to optimize the temperature and keeping those gilts comfortable, especially certain times of the year when we're talking about seasonal infertility, especially thinking about trying to mitigate any of those negative effects of heat stress. So making sure we're having sufficient air movement in those barns, as well as certainly during certain times of the year, we have some sort of an evaporative cooling system in place. And that's ultimately going to help gilts come into estrus sooner and hopefully reduce the number of gilts that maybe have a short or a weak heat, and hopefully identify those ones a lot easier for the farm staff. Shown here is just some general common recommendations for ventilation rates. So you can see when we're starting weaned pigs, obviously we're going to be looking at 1.5 CFM per pig at a minimum vent, but clear up to a maximum ventilation. We're looking at really at a minimum of 120 and really probably upwards more of 150 CFM when we start to get to those 300-pound gilts or more breeding age and breeding weight gilts. So you can see we have a very dynamic range, even just looking at a 1,200 head barn as the amount of CFMs that's required through different times of the year. So overall, just some general recommendations when we think about managing the environment within our GDUs. Farms with internal multiplication, so farms that have the luxury to be able to produce their own replacement gilts in-house, there may be some opportunity or some advantage to trying to split suckle those litters in order to maximize that gilt colostrum consumption and ultimately help those gilts boost that pre-weaning growth rate as we've discussed. Also maybe an opportunity to cross-foster gilts and provide those maternal F1 litters with more access to the underline to make sure that they're getting as much milk and nutrients during that pre-weaning phase as well. Certainly want to provide gilts with ample amount of space. In general, thinking 12 square feet, starting around that 22 to 24 weeks of age at the latest, and really around that time is when we'll probably start boar exposure as well. And when we think about modern systems and how some farmers may be adapting to certain legislation requirements such as Prop 12. Those requirements state that those gilts have to have 24 square feet by 26 weeks of age. So really setting those gilts up and trying to find ways to optimize or allow for additional square footage can potentially help them obviously be more successful, get them off to a stronger start within the breeding herd. And then lastly, just monitoring gas and ammonia levels and making sure we're trying to keep that target level below 10 parts per million there. So with that, thank you for your attention. And with Iowa State University, I'm Matt Romoser.